So far, we have covered two blocks, and today we are going to take up the third block, which talks about the 20th century fiction. A quick recap of what we've done in the earlier episodes. That was block one, which uh, talks about the 18th century novel. Okay, how the novel has evolved. Uh, how did it uh, uh, just its rise and growth, basically. And then we had a novel of Daniel Defoe called Robinson Crusoe. Then we also have Joseph Andrews by Henry Fielding. Then coming to the second block, we did about Victorian fiction. So the fiction during Victorian period, and it was 19th century novel where we looked into it in the aspect of its intro, the background, and what kind of and the features of that period. Then coming to the novels which were given in this block were Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen, and then we also had looked into Charles Dickens' Hard Times, right? Now, coming to the third block, where we have the 20th century fiction, right? So, in 20th century fiction, again, the same thing. We're going to look into its the modernism. Why is it so called a modernistic novel? What is it that varies from the previous earlier periods, that is 18th and 19th? Why is it labeled as a modern novel? Then what makes it modern modernist literature? Why is it grouped under that terminology, right? And then we also have Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf, prescribed for this block. Then for this period, modernistic literature. Then we also have Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. Okay, let us quickly move into uh, the 20th century fiction called as modernist novel, right? So let me just share the screen with you. So here we have the 20th century literature, the historical background. I mean, let me just give you a glimpse of what actually goes at the back of this kind of literature during the 20th century period. So basically, let me just give you something about what modernism was. It refers to a global movement. So refers to a global movement in society and culture that from the early decades of the 20th century sought a new alignment with the experience and values of modern industrial life. Now, building on late 19th century precedents, artists around the world used new imagery, materials, and techniques to create artworks that they felt better reflected the realities and hopes of modern societies. Although many different styles are encompassed by the term, there are certain underlying principles that define modernist art. Now, a rejection of history and conservative values and innovations and experimentation with form, with a tendency to abstraction and an emphasis on materials, techniques, and processes. Okay, and then modernism has also been driven by various social and political agendas. Now, these were often utopian, and modernism was in general associated with ideal versions of human life and society and a belief in progress. Right. Now, coming to the so if you look at into the historical background of this 20th century literature, there was an increasing instability of society, imperialism as the reawakening of a dominating spirit, imperial federation, an absence of generally accepted view of life, a bewildering variety of intellectual and material influence, and a reaction against Victorianism, the usual overlapping of old and new ideas, a rapid advance of applied science. Now, when you talk about this modernistic literature, it is nothing but the expression of the modern era, which tends to revolve around themes of individuality, the randomness of life, mistrust of government and religion, and the disbelief in absolute truth. So when you actually look into the literature, okay, maybe any piece of work, maybe a novel, a short story, a poem, or whatever it is, and these were certain things which reflected in the literature of the 20th century. It was mostly because of the effects after World War One, lost generation, depression, new naturalism, anti-utopianism, and fear. Now, the other part of it was effects after World War Two, disillusion, dissatisfaction, alienation, right? So now, if you look at the literary works, you would get to see a lot of these pop novels, scientific novels, individual self, nature, imagism was becoming a trend of the British and American poetic movement. Stream of consciousness was another important aspect of this period, where it talks about the flow of thought of the waking mind, depression, slump in the world economy, and new naturalism, combination of realism and romance, disillusion and the angry young men, dissatisfaction and alienation against middle class values, and a release of working class energies. Then we had Beat Generation, the mid 50s, discontent against square society. So the when you talk about the influences of modern literature, the three thinkers who influenced the modern era and modern literature the most are probably Charles Darwin, Karl Marx, and Sigmund Freud. This is not to say that modern authors were ardent evolutionists or Marxists or even practitioners of Freudian psychology. Rather, these thinkers simply fueled and framed the perspectives and debates that formulated so much modern art and literature. Today, Freud's specific theories are largely dismissed as unscientific. Still, these ideas had a profound influence and on art and literature as much as on a common daily perception, uh, conceptions of existence and reality. So, what are the kind of fiction we get to see during 20th century literature? In fiction, it was mostly talking about the kind of novels or the kind of fiction we would come across was realism and naturalism, detective and crime story. When you talk about a novel, it's like Effect of Wars, pop novels, and novels which explore the interrelation between the individual self, social self, and nature, stream of consciousness. Then the short story, history and biography, and essay. So coming to the novel in 20th century, where you know the art form of the novel. Now, before I get into the 20th century novel, let me just give you like what were the basic characteristics of modern literature. Modernism, as we know, searches for new voices and untraditional values. So there were basically five main features in modern literature. The main being include individualism, experimentation, symbolism, absurdity, and formalism. Now, what defines modern literature or modern English literature? So the English literature refers to works of British authors. British literature is associated with uh, UK, Isle of Man, and the Channel Islands. And the largest part of British literature is written in English, but there are some works written in other languages too. And when you talk about the modern literature, what is basically, how do you consider this to be a modern literature? It's basically from the modernist period, and the modernist period, which refers to late 19th and early 20th centuries. Now, in this period, modern literature was written, explained, and spoken. Now, what were the main themes of modern English literature? Now, it was all about the new period of art that progressed after World War II. Since literary modernism is a response opposed to the traditional writing practices and industrialism, a wide array of themes are present within modernist writings. Now, these themes include alienation, then transformation and consumption. So, when you look into the art form of the novel, what does that mean? So, this 20th century novelists have laid great stress on the art form of the novel. They have shown great consciousness of form, and the modern novelist has rejected the irrelevances of the Victorians, their moralizing and direct appeal to the dear reader of the society. Now, modern novels are not loose and rambling like novels of Dickens and Thackeray, but have compactness of their own. Now, coming to the novel of ideas, what does this mean? In the first decades of 20th century, the novel was mainly confined to the discussion of the problems confronting us in the social life. So, the Edwardian novel was essentially a novel of ideas, including in its scope a free discussion of all kinds of ideas: scientific, social, political, industrial, and so forth. Now, it had a definite social purpose and aimed at the solution of social problems, domestic problems, and problems arising out of the stress and form of storm of economic life. Now, when you talk about the sex and primal human emotions, now during the modernist period, a new tendency began to be perceptible in English fiction, and it centered around the glorification of sex and primal human emotions and passions. The Victorian novelists and poets had frowned on the naked dance of sex in their works and exalted married love over illegal flirtation. So the Victorian prudery about sex morality was given a jolt by the modernist novels, and several prominent novelists got busy with the presentation of sex relations in their novels. Now, coming to the psychological fiction, what does this stand for? So, looking at psychological fiction, 20th century fiction began to come under the influence of psychologists, and as the years advanced, the psychological tendencies became more pronounced in the 20th century fiction. A new technique was developed in the psychological fiction. The new trend found its best exposition in the stream of consciousness, which was cultivated in all its complexity by William James, Dorothy Richardson, James Joyce, and Virginia Woolf. Now, the stream of consciousness fiction. The stream of consciousness novelists follow the expressionist technique of presenting the characters not by reporting their actions and saying as observed by a recorder, but by making the characters themselves reveal their inner thoughts, moods, and feelings, however inconsequent, fragmentary, and fleeting these may be. Then the novels of Dorothy Richardson presents the first experiment in the stream of consciousness fiction. Now, basically, this was a kind of an uh, stream of consciousness was a kind of an element in their novels or in the fiction, which actually is like a bit of fragments. As the thoughts flow into their mind, they would just pen it down. Like it, you can even call it like a more or less like your inner monologue. I mean, whatever you start feeling, you just try to put it on a paper, and that becomes a kind of a narrative or a kind of a story or kind of a literary piece. And that was called stream of consciousness. Now, what was it that was lacking in this? There was no coherence, or there was nothing like, I mean, you could not comprehend it because they would go haywire. And as the thoughts would flow into the mind of the writer, they would kind of write it down. So that was um, they started experimenting on this kind of element called the stream of consciousness. And Dorothy's novels, she presents the experience of Miriam Henderson in Pointed Roofs, and her story is continued in a series of sequels collectively called as Pilgrimage. Right. Now, coming to the next aspect, that is the science fiction. Closely allied with psychological trend in modern fiction is the tendency to employ science for purpose of romance. Science has considerably influenced the work of the modern novelists. Science has revealed to the modern novelists innumerable aspects of life and nature, and has opened new vistas of thought and imaginations to be employed in fiction. Now, The Brave New World of Aldous Huxley is a satirical exposure of the condition brought about by science. Huxley's The Brave New World is written under the influence of behaviorism or determinism, under which continual repetition of the same phenomenon gives rise to definite type of nervous reaction, which then becomes stereotype, habitual, and hereditary. Next, moving on to the detective fiction. Detective fiction, popularized by Arthur Conan Doyle in The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. And it was given a further impetus in 20th century. In 20th century fiction by G.K. Chesterton, Edgar Wallace, and Dorothy Sayers and Agatha Christie. Right. And I would also suggest you to kindly look into the look into this, check your progress. You have to attempt it. Then I'm sure it'll be quite easy to understand given there. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, thank you so much. Right. So moving on to the next. Right. The influence of French in modernist novel. So the inventor of the term modernity in French was not Chateaubriand, who used it for the first time in his memoirs to qualify the lack of beauty of the present age, but Charles Baudelaire, whose painter of modern life launched the equation of beauty with modernity. So the term modernist was used in 1872, around the time of Pater's Renaissance, almost a decade before Henry James' Portrait of a Lady. And in 1872, London appeared to Verlaine, much as New York appeared to Duchamp in 1915, the embodiment of a bold and stark modernity. Then Charles Baudelaire used the term modernity in French for the first time. So The Laurels Are Cut is an 1887 novel by French author Dujardin, first published in the magazine Revenue Independent. He was as an early user of the literary technique, stream of consciousness, and Les Lauriers exemplifies the style. Dujardin claimed later in a study of the technique and its application in Ulysses by James Joyce that he was the first to use it in Les Lauriers. Right. So again, when you talk about this interior monologue, so which is closely related to the soliloquy, but of course it is not a soliloquy, and dramatic monologue, the interior monologue was first used extensively by Dujardin in Les Laurier's song Cope. I mean, this is a French word. The pronunciation is slightly difficult, but I'm just trying to. So, well to the woods no more, and later became a characteristic device of the 20th century psychological novel. So, this is the impact of French on these modernist novels. Right. So, let us look into the experiments with language and style in modernist novel, a study, James Joyce. So, James Joyce was an Irish novelist, short story novel writer, poet, and playwright born in Dublin. Joyce wrote several volumes and an autobiographical novel which follows his life from infancy to his first departure for Paris. Joyce subsequently wrote an unsuccessful play published in 1918 and furthermore a slight volume of verses. These were amid the beginnings of his two great works to come, Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake. These both occupied the remainder of his life. Now, his distinct writing style varies in each work due to remarkable use of diction, innovative symbolism, interior soliloquies, and monologues and epiphanies. Now, his work is also marked by the amount of complexity exercised in writing. Critics and readers have noticed a multi layered but careful meaning fabrication in his prose works. He has also touched modern psychology in his fiction works. As far the language is concerned, he followed traditional and formal diction of Dublin. He often employs Irish slang, especially in Finnegan's Wake. He noticeably uses foreign words to create puns and allegory. So if you look at the themes in Joyce's work, uh, we come across Joyce's mastery in fabricating narratives in unmatched. He let flow from his pen random and useful thoughts just as they actually are. This approach in writing is called psychological realism. It leads to analyze the inner thoughts of the character and how they perceive the realities of the world. Now, just like other modernists, he was interested in modern psychoanalysis, cultural experimentation, and other artistic trends in the field of arts. He particularly touched them of sexual oppressiveness, social taboos, and dualistic moral values. And another important aspect is nationalism. Though Joyce rejected nationalistic attitude in his writing, yet nearly all the works are set in Dublin, the capital of the Ireland. He rejected his country and remarked, as I'm sick of my own country, sick of it. This shows that his reaction to the repressive environment of the country. Now, again, another aspect is exile. Most part of Joyce's life was spent in abroad countries, especially in Europe. He made the choice of voluntary exile out of uh, the chaos created by fanatics. He lived in Zurich, Trieste, and Paris. He came upon the screen as the most cosmopolitan Irish writer for his open mindedness. And he always preferred the life exile upon patriotic writers. Then Joy's schooling was done in a Jesuit school. This training sets the stance for his literary and philosophical viewpoints. Now, if you look at the opening of the novel Ulysses, Buck Mulligan sets half serious and half ironic tone against Catholicism. So, religion in terms of repentance, guilt, and sin dominates all over his thematic constructions. Right. Now, let us quickly have a look at the conflictual modernism, a study of D.H. Lawrence. Now, Lawrence's writings are very intimately bound up with his life. Despite its variety and occasional self contradictionness at the level of ideas, Lawrence's writing does display a unity. Now, David Herbert Lawrence, better known as D.H. Lawrence, was an author who marked the transition between the 19th and the 20th century as he lived from 1885 until 1930. He is categorized among the modernists, for he expressed new ideas in literature, which often turned him into a controversial author. The Norton Anthology of English Literature introduces Lawrence as constantly at war with the mechanical and artificial, with the constraints and hypocrisies that civilization imposes. Because he had new things to say and a new way of saying them, he was not easily or quickly appreciated. Although his early novels are more conventional in style and treatment, from the publication of The Rainbow, the critics turned away in bewilderment and condemnation. I mean, basically, Lawrence is a very genius person, and the the novel which he had written, The Rainbow and the Women in Love, are unrealistic, that he has an appalling style and that he repeats himself. And in fact, he was attempting something so ambitious in his response to life that he found language as commonly used insufficient. Right. So, moving on to Virginia Woolf. As we have the prescribed novel of Virginia Woolf, Mrs. Dalloway. So we will quickly look into her bio of Virginia Woolf. Now, during the interwar period, Woolf was a significant figure in London literary society and a member of Bloomsbury Group. Her most famous works include the novels Mrs. Dalloway. Now, this is what we have it in the text. To the Lighthouse, which was published in 1927, and Orlando in 1928, and the book length essay, A Room of One's Own, 1929, with its famous dictum, a woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction. So, a peep into her life. Her father, Leslie Stephen, was an eminent Victorian man of letters. She grew up in a literary and intellectual atmosphere with free access to her father's library. Then the Second World War increased her anxiety and fears. After rewriting drafts of her suicide note, she put rocks into her pockets and drowned herself in the river Ouse. So her lifespan from 1882 to 1941. So this was her literary career. The Voyage Out, Night and Day, these both being traditional narratives. Jacob's Room, narrative experimentation with the novel. And Mrs. Dalloway, and To the Lighthouse, a more completely developed stream of consciousness technique. As a feminist writer, the themes of androgyny, women and writing, and Mrs. Dalloway, which describes Clarissa Dalloway and Sally Seton's relationship as young women. Then Orlando deals with androgyny. A Room of One's Own shows Woolf's concern with the question of women's subjugation and the relationship between women and writing. Then, as a modernist novelist, her main aim was to give voice to the complex inner world of feeling and memory. As the human personality, a continuous shift of impressions and emotions. As a narrator, disappearance of the omniscient narrator. Then, looking at the point of view shifted inside the characters' minds through flashbacks, association of ideas, momentary impressions presented as a continuous flux. Right, coming to Mrs. Dalloway. So, this is her fourth novel, Mrs. Dalloway. The English modernist writer Virginia Woolf took on the subject of the English middle classes in the aftermath of the 1914 to 1918 war. She noted in her diary that she wanted to give life and death, sanity and insanity. I want to criticize the social system and to show it at work and at its most intense. So the form as well as the content of the novel is quintessentially modern. Woolf's pioneering stream of consciousness technique reflected her desire to show the multifaceted nature of consciousness and to capture the impact of the fast changing modern world on the psyche. So, a dream-like narrative carries the reader through a crowded city and into the minds of different isolated individuals. We particularly focus on Mrs. Clarissa Dalloway, a middle-aged society lady, and Septimus Warren Smith, a shell-shocked young demobbed soldier like James Joyce's Ulysses. The action is primarily confined to one day, in this case, in June 1923. The novel begins with the line Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself, as she spends the day preparing for a party and ends with the party taking place in the evening as she hears in passing of Septimus' suicide. Nevertheless, the book takes us out of any strict temporal frame by incorporating moments of reminiscence from a number of characters. Now, the kind of themes we come across in this Mrs. Dalloway is communication versus privacy, disillusionment and despair, time, and so on. So, throughout Mrs. Dalloway, Virginia Woolf gives us glimpses into the minds of her characters while at the same time showing their outward communication with other people. This framework leads to a complex series of relations, and her characters deal with the privacy, loneliness, and communication of these relationships in different ways. There is something called time factor also in her novel, Mrs. Dalloway, which takes place over the course of one day. And its very framework, Woolf emphasizes the passage of time. Now, all the novel's action is so compressed that a few minutes can fill many pages. Right. We even can see stress and mental illness, where, she goes deeply into characters' imagination. So the mental instability experienced by Septimus and Clarissa feels real and honest to the reader. Both feel depression and pain, but can still see the beauty in life. The novel also discusses the effect mental illness has on loved ones, such as lonely Rezia Smith. So, if you look into the characters here, Clarissa Dalloway, a London society lady of 51, the wife of a conservative MP, Richard Dalloway, who has conventional views on women's rights, had a possessive father, refused Peter Walsh, a man who would force her to share everything. And characterized by opposing feelings, her need for freedom and independence, and her class consciousness, her life appears to be an effort towards order and peace, an attempt to overcome her weakness and sense of failure. Then we have Septimus Warren Smith, a young poet and lover of Shakespeare. When the war broke out, enlisted for patriotic reasons, an extremely sensitive man who can suddenly fall prey to panic and fear or feelings of guilt. A character specifically connected with the war suffers from headaches and insomnia, finally commits suicide. So novel moves from one character to another. We see the internal thoughts of each major character. Inner honest thoughts are contrasted with superficial interactions with other characters that frequently cause frustration, realized or unrealized. Okay, looking at the plot of this Mrs. Dalloway, Richard Dalloway eats lunch with Hug Whitewood and Lady Bretton, members of high society. After lunch, Richard returns home to Clarissa with a large bunch of roses. He intends to tell her that he loves her, but finds that he cannot because it has been so long since he last said it. Meanwhile, Septimus and Lucrezia are in their apartment, enjoying a moment of happiness together before the men come to take Septimus to the mental hospital. Dr. Holmes arrives and Septimus fears the doctor will destroy his soul and he jumps from a window to his death. Peter hears the ambulance go by to pick up Septimus' body and marvels ironically at the level of London civilization. He goes to Clarissa's party. Sir William Bradshaw arrives late, and his wife explains that one of his patients, the young veteran, that is Septimus, has committed suicide. Clarissa retreats to the privacy of a small room to consider Septimus' death. She understands that he was overwhelmed by life and that men like Sir William make life intolerable. She identifies with Septimus, admiring him for having taken the plunge and for not compromising his soul. She feels with her comfortable position as a society hostess, responsible for his death. The party nears its close as guests begin to leave. Clarissa enters the room and her presence fills Peter with a great excitement. Now, the themes over here are communication versus privacy. Mrs. Dalloway, uh, Clarissa, Septimus, Peter, and others struggle to find outlets for communication as well as adequate privacy. And the balance between the two is difficult for all to attain. Clarissa, in particular, struggles to open the pathway for communication and throws parties in an attempt to draw people together. At the same time, she thinks the ultimate human mystery is how she exists in one room while the old woman in the house across from hers exists in another. Even as Clarissa celebrates the old woman's independence, she knows it comes with an inevitable loneliness. Now, disillusionment with British Empire. When Mrs. Dalloway takes place, the old establishment and its oppressive values are nearing their end. English citizens, including Clarissa, Peter, and Septimus, feel the failure of the empire as strongly as they feel their own personal failures. The threat of oppression. Oppression is a constant threat for Clarissa and Septimus in Mrs. Dalloway, and Septimus dies in order to escape what he perceives to be an oppressive social pressure to conform. Miss Kilman and Sir William Bradshaw are two of the major oppressors in the novel. Miss Kilman dreams of felling Clarissa in the name of religion, and Sir William would like to subdue all those who challenge his conception of the world. And this novel was ahead of its time in many ways, in many respects. It's rich in imagery, symbolism, and themes. Stream of consciousness was a technique that was innovative for this time. Virginia Woolf helped to change the novel. So basically, it's a novel of inner consciousness, more so picturing one day in the life of a woman, suggesting all that she could have experienced years before and contemplating all that should have happened had she been true to herself after becoming a mother. Mrs. Dalloway's world is world of memories and thoughts. The party she organizes in the novel is the mindset, and almost every character speaks out what he or she thinks. Mrs. Dalloway feels everywhere, which ironically means she belongs to nowhere, neither to the past nor to the present. Right. So, moving on to the next novel, that is by Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, right? Which retells the story of Marlowe's job as an ivory transporter down the Congo. Through his journey, Marlowe develops an intense interest in investigating Kurds, an ivory procurement agent, and Marlowe is shocked upon seeing what the European traders have done to the natives. Right. But before that, let us quickly look into Joseph Conrad's biography. Now, since its publication, The Heart of Darkness has fascinated readers and critics, almost all of them whom regard the novel as significant because of its use of ambiguity, foggishness to dramatize Marlowe's perceptions of the horrors he encounters. So, the title of this novel is Heart of Darkness. Joseph Conrad is the author, and it's basically a novella. So, what is a novella? It is slightly, it neither belongs to novel or a story, a short story. It is between a novel and a short story in length and scope. Now, the genre, symbolism, colonial literature, adventure tale, frame story, almost a romance in its insistence on heroism and the supernatural, and its preference for the symbolic over the realistic. Now, his Heart of Darkness had its genesis in his personal experience working on a Congo River steamer in 1890, 5 years after King Leopold of Belgium established the Congo Free State. In 1898, when Conrad sat down to write the story, conditions in the Congo were already becoming a political issue in England. Protests by the Aborigines Protection Society of systematic abuses in the Congo led to debate in the British House of Commons in 1897. Now, the characters, if you look into it, the protagonist of Heart of Darkness and Malo is philosophical, independent minded, and generally skeptical of those around him. He is also a master storyteller, eloquent, and able to draw his listeners into his tale. Although Malo shares many of his fellow Europeans' prejudices, he has seen enough of the world and has encountered enough debased white men to make him skeptical of imperialism. If you look into the style, Heart of Darkness is a frame story, a story within a story. The first narrator sets the scene, describes the boat and the themes, and introduces Marlowe, the primary narrator. The structure mimics the oral tradition of storytelling. Readers settle down with the sailors on the boat to listen to Marlowe's narrative. Oral storytelling brings with it associations of fables, legends, and epic journeys. Readers are introduced to the idea that the tale Marlowe tells is a quest, a myth. And looking at the motives, darkness, lies, hypocrisy, imperialization, colonization, power corrupts, savage versus civil. These are some of the motives we come across in this Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness. So here it goes with the summary of the first part, waiting for the tide to turn. The men listen to Marlowe's story. He tells them how he has always been interested in Africa and how he used his aunt's contacts in Belgium to find a job in a colonial trading post up the river Congo. Marlowe starts a 30-day journey on the French steamboat until they get to the company's outer station. He stands in horror when faced with the living condition of the native people there and the way in which they are treated. So basically, the Heart of Darkness exposes the dark side of Belgian colonization while exploring the three levels of darkness that the protagonist Marlowe encounters. The darkness of the Congo wilderness, the darkness of the Belgians' cruel treatment of the natives, the unfathomable darkness within every human being of committing heinous acts of evil. Now, looking at the themes in Heart of Darkness, um, Conrad's view of the world is that there are dark, chaotic forces that continually threaten to destroy individuals and whole civilizations. The only protection from this is the resolute steadfastness of men and their stubborn reliance on each other, no matter how hopeless the situation or how powerful the forces of darkness may appear. In physics, this would be like the principle of entropy, which states that the tendency of all organized systems is toward dissolution and decay. People die, bodies decay, civilizations fall, and only constant effort and attention to preservation can halt these forces, and then only temporarily. In philosophy, Conrad can be seen as a precursor of the existentialists, who likewise believed that the inevitable fate of each individual was darkness and oblivion, but that humans must not surrender to these destructive impulses. Now, Heart of Darkness is structured as a frame tale, not a first person narrative. So here, Marlowe's story is told by the anonymous narrator who listens to Marlowe on the deck of the Nelly. So Conrad's frame narrator, like the reader, learns that his ideas about European imperialism are founded on a number of lies that he wholeheartedly believed. So by the end of the novella, Marlowe's tale significantly changes the narrator's attitude toward the ship and men of the past. Only the narrator and the reader understand Marlowe's initial point. Civilized Europe was once a dark place, and it has only become more morally dark through the activities of institutions like the company. Now, another point here I would like to mention is Joseph Conrad intentionally made Heart of Darkness very difficult to read. He wanted the language of his novella to make the reader feel like they were fighting through the jungle, just like Marlowe fought through the jungle in search of Kurds. Now, there's been a movie also of this, which was called as Apocalypse Now. Now, if you look at the major symbols of this novel, you find Kurds, the Congo River, Ivory, England. Now, the major thematic topics, as I already discussed, colonialism, racism, savagery versus civilization. Now, if you look at the setting, it has actually had taken place on the deck of the Nelly, the Congo River. So, a bit about the author. Joseph Conrad was born in Berdyshev in a predominantly Polish part of Ukraine on December 3rd, 1857. And Conrad's brief togetherness with his father has been an enduring influence on his later years. His devotion to literature, interest in revolutionary politics, attitude towards Russia, a skeptical view of the world, and sometimes an adventurous spirit ensue from that. And after his father's death, Conrad was cared for by family and friends, particularly his maternal uncle, who became a second father to Conrad. Over the years, Bobrovsky exerted a strong influence on Conrad, and so Conrad's character seems to have been affected by both his father's and his uncle's personalities. Now, he worked on several English ships, and in 1880, he studied to become an officer, passed his examinations, and shortly thereafter became the third mate aboard the Loch Etive. Wishing to move up the professional ladder, Conrad went in search of a position as second mate, finally obtaining one aboard the Palestine in November 1881. His experience aboard the Palestine was to become the raw material for one of his most important short stories, Youth. Conrad found himself ashore in Bombay, in India, in 1884, where he accepted a position as second mate aboard the Narcissus. This experience was to form the basis for his first great novel, The Nigger of the Narcissus. Now, Conrad's experience in the Congo had an enormous impact on him. Despite its relative brevity, it would affect him for the rest of his life, and as much as anything else influenced his outlook on civilization and human existence itself. So his criticism of the abuses and disorder he witnessed was unrelenting, as evidenced in his various writings on the subject. Some of his major novels of Joseph Conrad are Almayer's Folly, An Outcast of the Islands, The Nigger of the Narcissus, Heart of Darkness, Lord Jim, Nostromo, The Secret Agent, Under Western Eyes, Chance, Victory, The Arrow of Gold, The Rescue, The Rover. So these were some of his major works. Right. So I want you all to go through the material, and also the plot, the summary, the background, theme, the critical reception, in order to understand it in detail. Okay, I've just given you a gist of this novel and about the writers. Both the writers, the Virginia Woolf and Joseph Conrad, and their works, Mrs. Dalloway and Heart of Darkness. So with this, I end the session. So next class, that is tomorrow again. If you have any doubts, you can come up. I hope you all followed the lesson, but still I want you all to go through the lesson. I mean, the unit, the block, entire block 3, which we have almost completed it. So any kind of doubt, queries about it, you can ask me tomorrow. Right.